Hello, I'm Sean Duffy. I'm the founder of the Duffy Agency and a lecturer here at the Lund University School of Economics and Management. Today we're going to talk about consumer behavior. Now, as marketers, we're always trying to do three things. Basically understand, shape, and anticipate consumer behavior. Today I'd like to just look at one of those aspects, understanding consumer behavior. And to do that, I'd like to start out by first talking about how we generate interest among consumers in our brands. Then I'd like to talk about probably what's the most powerful tool or skill a marketer has, and that's the power of perspective. Third, we're going to try to explore brands and products the way consumers see them, which is very different than the way sellers often see them. And we'll look at value, how consumers appraise value to make a final purchase decision. Let's start by how we can focus on what's interesting to consumers right off the bat. To do this, I'd like to start with the brand equity model. If you remember that interest is that step after awareness and understanding. So once the consumer you have their attention and they understand what it is you're offering, the next is to get their interest. And this is one of the toughest hurdles for many brands because any product will have dozens of features and benefits, and companies have a hard time narrowing that focus of their offer down. So I have a quick exercise you can use to do this at the outset. These are the three sets of variables you'll need to map out to start. So first, you make a list of all the features and benefits that your product offers. Next, ask yourself, which of these things does the target really want? Now, this should be based on research. Short of that, you'd have to use your best guess, I suppose. But keep those things and cross out all the rest. Next, from that list, ask yourself, of the things that are left, which does the competition offer? And if the competition offers something that's on that list, cross that off as well. Now, the things that are left are the things that your target finds valuable and that your competitors don't offer, or they're not perceived as offering even if they do. And that's the sweet spot. Basically, your features and benefits that are differentiated in value. This list probably won't be one thing, it could be several, but at least it's a starting point. The important thing to remember is that any amount of target data won't do you any good unless you can apply it in your work. And to apply it, you'll need more than research and analytical skills. You'll need to cultivate the skill of thinking backwards from your target's perspective. And that's really the essence of good strategy. So next, I'd like to look at a few tools to help you do that, to see the world as your target market does. The power of perspective. Being able to see the world from your target's perspective is probably the most valuable skill you can have as a marketer. It's also one of the most difficult to master. First, because it's not natural, and second, because you're often not trained how to do it in school. The easy way to look at it is anytime you're approaching a marketing assignment, picture your target market like this, on the other side of a pane of glass, and you just have to communicate with them. Sounds simple enough. So, you decide what you want to say, and then you get your message out in front of them, like this. But stop for a minute and consider how things look from their perspective. What your target audience sees is this. And although it was crystal clear from the writer's perspective, your perspective, it's completely cryptic from the reader's perspective. And companies do this all the time in many different ways, such as focusing on features and benefits that reflect the company's priorities, not the target's. Or creating return policies that increase efficiencies inside the company but make it impossible for customers. Or messaging and imagery that the ad agency finds hip but the target finds completely cryptic. Or naming systems that make sense internally but not to outsiders. Or optimizing websites for keywords that the target actually never uses. We call this inside-out thinking, and companies do it all the time. Why? It's super difficult to think backwards from the target's perspective. This is our objective. We want to create a brand presence that makes sense from the target's perspective, one that reflects their reality even if it doesn't reflect our own as much. And this includes making it easy for them to understand what our product does and how it's different, having complete alignment between their needs and your offer, having relevant content that reflects subject matter they're interested in, and facilitating their needs beyond the need to simply buy your product. It also means helping them feel like your communication is talking to them specifically, not everyone on the planet. And it all starts with one skill: learning to think and communicate backwards from the target's perspective. And that starts with target research, but comes from your strategic discipline and experience in using it. Now, most marketing communication companies don't do that. They're talking to themselves. And that's a fantastic opportunity for the rest of us. In this kind of environment, like we see here, most companies don't really connect with consumers, and the few that do really stand out. Basically, talking to yourself is extremely effective camouflage if you'd like to blend in. This is a short mantra that I think is especially useful if you're marketing online. Go where the people are, not where you'd like them to be. Talk about what people care about, not what you'd like them to care about. Make it about their needs, not yours. And overall, be relevant. Now, we've already said that basically you have 4 elements to work with: product, price, place, promotion. But while you're working with those 4, the consumer actually only ever sees one thing when they look at a product, and that is value. So we should take a look and see how consumers choose and how they determine value. This is how most sellers compete. They have a product, it has a function and a price tag, and maybe they'll put a coupon in to get you down there to buy it. Very rational, but very ineffective from a branding standpoint, because buyers see things quite differently than this. Basically, we've developed a hypothesis that we use to understand how consumers see a client's products. And that looks more like this. We may not be aware of it, but whether it's a cough drop or a new car, we assess what we'll get from the product in relation to our needs. And we evaluate that in terms of the core features, value-add features, and value-add associations. And we'll go through that in a second. We don't look at the price tag as much as we assess the total cost to us. In other words, what we have to give in relation to our resources to get that thing. And these could be things like time, hassle, risk, and of course money. And at the end, we decide according to value. That is the balance and the best balance we get between what I have to give in relation to my needs, resources, and options, and what I'm going to get. So let's take a moment to take a look at each one of those 3 factors. If we apply consumer perspective to products, we might see something like this. Although you probably don't think about it, you and most buyers value products in 3 dimensions. Basically, core features, value-add features, and value-add associations. This is an evolution of Cutler's 3 levels of a product. And we'll go through why it's evolved in a second. Basically, your core features will be tangible features that directly affect the core function that define the category and are required for inclusion in it. If it's a Pilates ball, it probably has to be a certain size with a certain amount of air pressure inside and a certain durability factor. Then you have value-add features. These are tangible features that add functionality. It could be anything from pricing, convenience to buy, warranty, service, support, the design of the thing. These can be standardized and expected by consumers as the years go on. So they're difficult to remain unique in the long term, but they can provide a huge advantage in the short term or midterm. Lastly are value-add associations. These are intangible. They're shaped largely through communication, and they reflect on the product. These could be things like quality, reliability, status. Also, they reflect on the user's status, prestige, social responsibility, environmental awareness. A typical example of this would be if a famous celebrity or sports figure were to wear or use this Pilates ball, for example. That doesn't change the Pilates ball, but it could help sell a lot more of them if it's important to the target market. Now, if you remember, I had said that this is slightly different than Philip Kotler's model. And the reason behind that is that you should remember, if you're using this, that all the rings aren't weighed equally. In fact, that rarely ever happens. The weight of the rings depends on the value priorities and value perceptions of the people you're marketing to. Now, in my case, this is how I perceive these products' value. If we start with the Rolex, it's an expensive watch. But I don't think this watch tells time any better than any other watch, at least for my needs. The design isn't really anything special for me, nor the warranty or the service features. I think a lot of the reason why Rolex sells is because of the associations with the brand, the affluence, the elitism, the sports. These are hard to copy, and that's why these watches can sell at 100 times more than the price of, say, a Timex that tells time probably pretty much just as well, and may even offer a greater variety of designs. The smart car, that's slightly different. The core function here is transportation around the city, and this car excels at that, the core function, because of its size. So the black dot in the center tends to be a little bit bigger. But the value add is also pretty strong with this because it offers other benefits like low gas consumption, really cool design for a small car. And the brand, that also has some good associations with it. It's a well-known secret, or a well-publicized secret, that the brand is actually the child of Mercedes and Swatch. So this is really a product that's delivering, at least for the time being, on all three rings in different proportions. And then we've got cell phones. So what's the first thing someone asks you when you tell them you've got a new phone? How many megapixels is in the camera? How much memory did you get? Does it have a fingerprint pad? No one ever asks, how are the phone calls on that thing? Although they may ask that about the carrier. Phones are selling on the value-add features like cameras, video recorders, and music players. And that's why the core feature in there, the black part, is super small, where the value-add ring, in my case, is weighed pretty heavily. And then, of course, there's brand associations that come with strong brands and brand loyalty, like Apple, or, as you may have noticed with some of your friends, with BlackBerry as well. So shortly after moving to Sweden, I was sitting in my kitchen working on this model, and it was a hot summer day. And I was trying to think of an item where the core function, well, was pretty much it. And I couldn't come up with anything. And at that moment, the power went out in my kitchen. And my fridge and freezer had no power and began to thaw. So I ran around my apartment, pretty panicked, found the fuse box, and saw that the fuse for the kitchen had blown. And I had no fuses. And I didn't have a clue where to buy them in Sweden. So as my freezer began to melt, I ran down to the grocery store, and I found this IFO fuse. Now, I didn't care how much it cost. I didn't care who made it. I didn't care how long it would last. I just needed to get electricity from point A to point B. And so I solved two problems at once. I found an example and got my freezer back on. But bear in mind, these are my perceptions. For example, I bet an electrician would have a much different idea about that fuse and its value. So you as well may see these products very differently than the way I do. So how can any of this matter? That's because there are trends in perception that are usually shared by segments of a market, large segments of a market. And that's where segmenting the target comes in and the importance of it. The other thing to remember is that these trends change over time. And that's why you have to keep in contact with your target to see where they are so you can offer the value they seek. And that's really comes with the question of where is the value battle in your category at any given time. Let me show you an example. Oral contraceptives for women are a pretty good example of this. In the 1960s, the question really was, will it work? So the core functionality, preventing pregnancy, the black part, was quite big. And that's where the marketers would want to be putting their emphasis in their communication and building their brand around. Reliability, it will work. Today, if we look at it, the black part is pretty much taken for granted in most parts of the world. And people have moved on to other things. The value add section. A lot of birth control pills for women today are sold on side effect profiles like water retention, cramps. And value add like acne prevention and reduction of cancer are also some issues that pharmaceutical companies are looking into to market birth control pills. But this is a good example, I think, of the way that over time these rings mature. Typically, at the outset, the black part, the core function, is the most important part in a new category. Over time, that becomes significantly less important, and the second ring kicks in. But remember, all the things in the second ring usually are easily copied, and over time that too will shrink down until it's a battle of brands. A good example of that might be Coke and Pepsi, where the product differences, although some people claim they're huge, for many people aren't that far apart. It's really a matter of brand associations. Ericsson is probably one of the clearest examples of what happens when you don't pay attention to where the value battle is. If you remember, in the early 90s, Ericsson led the mobile phone market. And at that point, it was pretty much an engineering battle. They got the phones to be small, and they got them to have good reception. And back then, in the early 90s, that wasn't so easy to do because there weren't so many cell towers, and the technology was new. And so Ericsson did really well. But by the late 90s, there were more cell towers, and none of us were really afraid that we weren't going to be able to make a phone call on the thing. We were more interested in other things. And Nokia entered the picture, realizing that. And they started designing their phones very differently, with a much bigger screen and all sorts of small design extras. If you can see on this diagram, in 1999, when Nokia first introduced, I would say, a more designed phone, Ericsson was still lagging behind and actually didn't catch up to 2002. And they themselves, if you read this quote, basically admitted as much. They were focused on the engineering and the quality, but not where the consumers were. And the rest was history. As marketers, this is really interesting for us. Because before, in order to influence the product, in this case, let's say Nike, we would have had to have been a shoe manufacturer or know a lot about shoe manufacturing. But today, if you look at value add features that are being added that are actually part of Nike's product offer, this could be a thing like designing your own shoe, and this kind of mass customization, or the Nike Plus website that if you're not familiar with it, you should look into. It's a value add to the product, and it was created by online marketers such as ourselves. And of course, brand associations will always play a big part when dealing with sporting apparel, or you might say even fashion in Nike's case. And the strange thing about this is that this is also more or less a bank account. When Nike was found to be using child labor in sweatshops, the way they handled that situation and the positive associations and feelings they had towards their brand helped them through that crisis. In fact, their brand equity actually went up after the incident than the way it had been in the months leading up to it. Okay, so that's how consumers look at products. How do they choose? Specifically, how do they determine the value of one brand or product compared to another? Well, as you might guess, I have a model for that. Let's take a look at it. This model is based on a set of mental scales that every consumer has in their brains. Value is all about finding the right balance between what I give and what I get. In the mental scales here, the get side has to be perceived as balancing or outweighing the give side. Otherwise, there is no value. But it's important to remember that what you give is more than money, and what you get is more than product functionality. On the one side, we have what I get as a consumer. The weight of this is determined by how well it satisfies my wants and needs. On the other side, there's what I'll have to give to get that product. But it's not just price, it's total cost. That could involve things like money, time, effort, hassle, etc. The weight of this is determined in relation to resources and options. How much money, time, and effort do I have to give? And what other options do I really have? Whoever is perceived as tilting the scales the most to the right will get the sales. Pretty much end of story. Let me give an example. Take these two Cokes. One sells for €9.50, the other sells for 75 cents euro. Which offers the better value? Well, I was in a hotel room in Amsterdam. It got late, I had a big presentation in the morning, and I still had a lot of work to do. I was getting tired and I wanted a Coke. So I grabbed one out of the minibar and noticed that the price was almost €10. I knew there was a 24-hour convenience store about 2 blocks away where I could get the same Coke for about €1 or less. But it was raining, and I needed to get dressed to go out and get it, and it would probably take 20 minutes. Of course, I cracked open the Coke from the minibar and kept on working. For me, at that moment in time, the one on the left was a far better value than the one on the right. And this works particularly well when you perceive your options are limited, as I did at that point. That's probably the basic idea behind a minibar. So value is really the balance between what a person gives in total and what they get in relationship to their needs. Money's not the only price. There are other costs. And if we look at this model, things you might have to give: time, hassle, physical exertion, mental exertion, risk. There could be physical risk, social risk, career risk, monetary risk. And then, of course, there's the resources and the money, the price tag. And people will weigh different parts of this equation differently depending on their priorities. But as we said before, large swaths or segments of a population will tend to weigh them in the same way. And on the get side, it's not just the product and the core function. You could also be saving time. You could get pleasure, labor saving, physical labor saving, mental labor saving, security, health, well-being, status, both social status and career status, or perhaps even more resources and money. And of course, these priorities change with the resources, time, new information, pretty much anything. Again, that's why it's important to keep an eye on them. An easy example of this is a slightly fictionalized example of this chair. If we assume that the performance, appearance, and durability between these three chairs are comparable, then you've got to look at the different prices. All three sell well, so all three are offering value to certain segments of the population, who evidently have very different value perceptions. We'll explore this more in class, but using the value scales, think about how this could be. That IKEA, Scandinavian Design, which is an American upscale furniture store, and Fritz Hansen, who are actually the people who invented that chair, could charge such different prices for principally the same object. So people will always gravitate towards the product that they perceive offers the greatest value. Value is highly personal and based on perception, not necessarily reality. It's the only thing that matters and the only thing you can compete with. So in this sense, you're not really competing on products. You're competing on value perception, those scales. And your job as a marketer is pretty simple. You have to lighten up the give perception and weigh down the get perception while remaining truthful. And that's the super important part, while remaining truthful. I'd like to leave this topic by giving you something to think about. I'd like you to explore this idea in relation to our definition of value. I think if you do, it might save you a lot of time moving forward in your career. The idea is simple. Markets don't respond to quality, only value. Okay, we've tried to understand consumer behavior today. We've looked at the way the consumers look at products. We've looked at how they determine value. And we started with a simple model to help you narrow your focus to grab their interest to start with so they even see you or consider you. I think the last point that we just talked about, we'll talk a little bit more about in class. But before I leave, I just wanted to mention one thing. You might have noticed that the name of this lecture talked about consumer behavior online. And we haven't really talked a lot specifically about the internet. And the reason for that is this applies equally well to online or offline, as do many marketing principles. So it will definitely help you online, and if need be, it'll help you offline. Super. We'll pick up where we left off today in class, starting with that last slide, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.